Hello, Carole from the Women's Bookshop. Now, I'm really excited to see you've got a novel here by Ruth Ozeki, because I can remember reading a wonderful book of hers years ago called My Year of Meat.
Yes.
And I haven't encountered her since.
She's written one since then that wasn't as good. This one is wonderful. I think it's probably not quite as good as My Year of Meat, but still fantastic. I found it fascinating. It's called A Tale for the Time Being. And there's a lot of stuff about time being, and we are time beings. Fascinating. Ruth Ozeki's part Japanese, and she lives in the States. Well, she lives probably in Canada, if this is true, because there's two stories going on here. There's a writer called Ruth, who is Ruth, and her husband called Oliver, who is Oliver. I mean, at the end of the book, Ruth Ozeki thanks her husband Oliver. So she's used their real names, and they're living on quite a remote island up in Canada. And he is a very interesting character. It's a very loving portrait, and their relationship is very loving. At times Ruth feels quite isolated and wishes she was back in New York, and has been trying to write a non-fiction book for a long time, and it's not really getting anywhere, and she feels a bit stuck and so on. And she comes across on a wild beach on their island one day a plastic bag that's very sealed within plastic bags, sealed within plastic bags and so on. And inside is a diary and a series of letters and a watch. And she starts reading the diary, and the diary has been written by Naoko, which is shortened to Nao. And she is a 16-year-old Japanese girl. And this has been washed up on the beach all the way from Japan. The watch turns out to be, because it's got an engraving on the back of it, it turns out to be the watch of a kamikaze pilot from World War II. Wow. So there's all sorts of intriguing things going on. And you get engrossed with Ruth and with Oliver on discovering what all this means. So there's these two stories going on, because you're reading Nao's story as she writes it. And she is suicidal. And her father is suicidal. So there's interesting stuff about Japanese attitudes to suicide in it, and fascinating stuff about Japanese culture generally. And of course it relates to the suicide pilot, who turns out to be Ruth's father's uncle. And she writes also about her great-grandmother, who... No, great-grandmother? Her grandmother. Because she's must be her great-grandmother, because she's 104. Right. And she's a Buddhist nun. So there's also stuff about Tibetan Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, and yeah, it's quite sort of complex but absolutely intriguing.
I thought you were going to say maybe this plastic bag had come over from the earthquake.
Yes, well they wonder that. Yes, they're not sure. They think, how could it have got there? And Oliver knows. Like that. Yeah, well, Oliver knows a lot about the currents and how there are great plastic islands floating out there in the ocean of all this rubbish that the currents pull together. And he works out that in fact it's too soon for anything from the Japanese tsunami to have reached this quite inland island. He said anything from the tsunami would be on the outcoast. So maybe she dropped it deliberately or threw it in the sea, or so you don't quite know.
So it's kind of message in a bottle-ish a bit.
It is a bit, but absolutely intriguing. And there is quite a bit of stuff about the tsunami in it. And you spend the whole novel wondering if this gorgeous 16-year-old girl, whose voice she captures beautifully, the teenage voice, whether that girl is still alive or not. She'd be in her 20s now if she was still alive. And I'm not going to tell you whether she is or not.
Unraveling of great mystery.
But totally intriguing and very different. I mean, I love learning about other cultures and different attitudes and so on. And she's a very good writer, and she kept me hooked in.
Fabulous. Sounds great. Thank you very much, Carole.
Thanks, Lindsay.